I was trying to figure out how to define this, mainly just to record it for posterity and all that. I was originally intrigued by the idea that there was the Ken Burns documentary on when we were talking about World War II, and it's a full on. I got to pause this. Can't play the audio of this. This is a 2 hour and 24 minute documentary, PBS News, PBS Org, the Ken Burns documentary called The War, which is on World War II. Immensely important. It looks like there might be like 4 documentaries, maybe more. Uh, they follow the lives of like 4 family members and their involvement in the war. And if you look closely at this image too, this is of the creation of the. I think this is like the Strata Fortress bomber. This is the opening like hatch to like a lot of the Strata Force bombers because they created a lot of them. Looks like there was a third documentary from the, like I said, this PBS Org. This is Ken Burns. His 2 hour and 24 minute documentary on, but I also think there's multiple hour plus, 2 hour plus, because it says 2 hours and 24 minutes. This is the 1 hour and 44 minutes. So I think this one is this one. And I think if you click this, it's going to give you another 1 hour and 17 minute video, another 112 minute video, 139 minute video. It's like the Ken Burns documentary of World War II and Battle in the Pacific. And then, of course, the Pride of Our Nation, June 6th, 1944. Reason this is apropos or important is because we're in the month of June, and I feel like people forget kind of everything. All that. So I want to encapsulate something, which was oh, pause. Not allowed to play the audio of this. Not allowed to play this, but I can. Legally, there's a whole bunch of like U.S. copyright stuff, but technically, it's part of the Library of Congress. There's some weird, convoluted laws that are very weird because the what's it called? There's this technicality where yes, the Army, University of the Press is a part of the federal government because it operates as a publishing arm of the U.S. Army and DoD. And then there's technically by the DOL, the Department of Labor, .gov, public domain copyright and trademark patent information. It's materials or works created by the federal government are generally part of the public domain and may be used, reproduced, distributed without permission. So there's the overarching thing that I'm addressing here in this video, and I'll upload this to YouTube, that very convoluted, where it's like there's a defining aspect of any works created by the government is public domain. So it's generally materials produced by the federal agencies are in the public domain. All right. So it's like, but the AI is trying to say, oh, not everything is a public domain, but under U.S. copyright law, works, generally speaking, everything created by the federal government are part of their official duties or capacities is in the public domain, which pretty much means there's no copyright laws that apply to them, which allows you as an American or person to distribute, redistribute or reproduce, distribute without permission. You can do so because it's part of the public domain. There's no nothing stopping you, but there's different stuff. So like technically PBS, even though PBS is the public broadcasting service that is or was or is paid for by the US government. Like there's an allocation of federal funds, right, that go to PBS to produce American content. So it's like, doesn't this fall under all material of PBS as not copyright? But then you'll see something else saying because it's like the author is Ken Burns, he's then protected by copyright laws. So it's like I'm weird technicality where like I'm not allowed to like show this video. I can show a link to this video. I could be like, hey, go watch. I probably say over the course of 7 days, watch 30-minute segments of Ken Burns' World War II documentary because there's 144 minutes, 117 minutes, 112 minutes, 119 minutes. And it's probably more too. Yeah, there's a 126-minute video, a 119-minute video, there's a 127-minute video. And then it looks like Ken Burns did like a 2-minute, 8-minute, 1-minute segment. But ultimately, it looks like there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 giant videos, right? Almost like 7 movies about World War II, and essentially encompasses kind of everything. Yeah, right here. Even this 7th and last video. A World Without War, 127 minutes. Quote from Ken Burns: "A few weeks after the death of President Roosevelt shocks the country. German soldiers surrendered. Meanwhile, American sailors and soldiers and Marines endured the worst battle of the Pacific in the Okinawa chain of islands." Right in August, this is probably in August of 1945. American planes dropped, subatomic warheads onto the city of Hiroshima, a civilian city of Nagasaki, and then the Japanese then surrendered. Millions returned homes to now learn to live in a world without war. There's still a lot. That's a very small synopsis, but it is key synopsis because of in the 7th war documentary World War II that Ken Burns and PBS published, the Japanese Empire had invaded only like 20% of China. 80% of China was still under the Republic of China, the ROC. And there was a northern army faction of the PLA that kind of stayed up in the mountains in the northwest corner of China. But really only 20% of China was invaded and controlled by the Japanese Empire. The Japanese Empire had invaded all the Koreas, all the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. The reason I'm getting to this is that people should watch these 7 videos. I remember thinking growing up, I think in high school, I think we had to watch these back in like junior year. I was like 17 years old, right before I was a senior when I was 18. We had to watch and write a ton of papers based on what the Ken Burns documentary was. And then I remember even on my own, me and my friends, my family would sit and we'd watch the Ken Burns documentary. So that's that. Here's the official link at the top. You just Google Ken Burns, you go to his YouTube page, and then he has his own playlist of all his Ken Burns content. The PBS, good people, good guy, documentary. This is 40 years, 4 decades, so 40 years. Just documenting everything, the Vietnam War, resistance against fascists, controlling Third Reich, videos on the Roosevelts, the former Roosevelt's family, the former presidents of the Roosevelts, and they defined American governance in the 19th century. His documentaries on the Civil War in the 1950s and 60s of America. Ken Burns is good people. Let's get back to my own kind of amateurish historical point of view of the Philippines in the 19th century. And so we have the Spanish Empire had occupied a brutal occupation of the Philippines for 333 years. It spanned from 1565 of the 16th century until the ending of the 19th century, so the kind of beginning of it of the 20th century that I'll talk to. So you have the you know, that warfare was also there's so much. There's the Spanish American War technically, so like was a massive battle. Yeah, Spanish American War. This is the Spanish Empire versus the American governors. In 1898, beginning with the U.S. Declaration of War on April 25th, 1898, retroactive to, I guess, the 21st. These active hostilities or conflicts lasted roughly 3 months and included an armistice in August of 1898. The conflict was formally ended by the Treaty of Paris on December 10th, 1898. A lot of fighting. Battleship USS Maine mysteriously exploded and sank in the Havana Harbor of Cuba. April 21st, 1898, the United States institutes naval blockade of Cuba, marking the official start of the war because the Spanish Empire had control. The Philippines for 300, the Spanish Empire had control of the Philippines for 333 years, and the Spanish had control of their various colonies across the Americas. April 25th, 1998, U.S. Congress officially declared war against Spain. December 10th, 1898, the official Treaty of Paris signed, ending the conflict, resulting in Spain relinquishing Cuba, ceding Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. So it's like the Spanish Empire had a ton of control for 333 years. They lose this massive war against the United States, or the America's governments. And then the Spanish Empire then hands over all of their territorial control to like the Philippines and the 7,000 islands of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. And the Spanish Empire had relinquished, right, Cuba to the United States because we beat them in a war. So when I tell people that Cuba should be the 53rd state of the United States, it's in reference to 1898. And people are wondering why Cuba should be the 53rd state of the United States is because the 51st state should be, well, the other states should be, these, right? Puerto Rico, well, 51st state of the United States should be DC. The 52nd state of the United States should be Puerto Rico. And the 53rd state of the United States should be Cuba, because it goes back to December 10th, 1888, with the official Treaty of Paris, the Treaty of Paris that was signed, and in the conflict between the Spanish Empire and the United States government. And the Spanish Empire relinquished Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. But in terms of order, DC should be its own state, should be the 51st state. Puerto Rico should be the 52nd state, and Cuba should be the 53rd state, technically. They're within our North American, well, there's a reason why I didn't say Guam. The 51st state should be DC. Needs proper, it's already unconstitutional that it isn't a state. Should have proper representation by senatorial and state representatives, congressional state representatives, or congressional representatives. And Puerto Rico should be the 52nd state within our North American kind of hemisphere. And Cuba, legally speaking, should be the 53rd state within our North American hemisphere and all that. Back to the other point. Now, the Philippines is not in our hemisphere, even though, yes, this is the Spanish empire, the Empire of Spain, the Spain Empire, handed over 7,000 islands, the Philippines, to us and Guam. Technically, Guam should have its own governance, and of course, the Philippines should have its own governance because of FDR. Well, I'll get to that right now. FDR signed over the McDuffie Act in 1934, and of course, in 1935, the Philippines creates the Constitution of the Philippines. It formulates the Declaration of their Independence and the formation of the First Republic of the Philippines. Even though the Philippines would have been better off as being 7 major states as the 54th to like 61st states of the United States, because we see the Philippines suffering for like 89 years with their own kind of governance. And at least they would have had the power. Just imagine this for a second, right? That the Philippines only has 7,000 islands. If it had been broken apart into 7 states, they would have had the power of the U.S. dollar and the backing of U.S. law, and all ships would have rose, and the Philippines would have been better off growing with the U.S. stock exchange and protected by our U.S. laws than on their own. So it's like, because FDR did the right thing was actually the wrong thing. When FDR wrote the 1934 Tidings Act, and then in 1935, when the First Republic of the Philippines created their independent country, that government failed, right, over 89 years. But what they should have did economically was they should have been broken apart into, it could have been 15 new states, because there's like 7,000 islands. The Philippines then, check this out, in 1934 would have rose, right? If they had the US dollar powered economy, they would have been better off today than they are on their own, because they would have the power of the US dollar economy. They would have their own congressional representatives, their own state representatives, right? Hawaii doesn't realize it, but Hawaii would have ended up just like the Philippines today if they were left to their own accord. And guess what? The other example, Cuba should have been the 53rd state, and now that they're left to their own accord, is a failed state. Right? The Hawaii gets the benefit. If the Hawaiian government was left on their own, they would have turned into Cuba and the Philippines. Right? Corruption, failed state, dictatorships. But Hawaii benefits by being a state of the United States with the empowerment of US dollar economy. So the Hawaiian people, their fortunes rose with the US stock exchange and the power of the US economy. And the Philippines the Cuba left on their own, even though Cuba should have been the 53rd state of the United States, due to the Treaty of Paris in 1898. Cuba left on their own, became a failed dictatorial state. Massive inflation, broken economy. And the Philippines in their 89 years has dealt with what? They dealt with Ferdinand Marcos Sr., 20 years of an illegal governance, of a dictatorship, military dictatorship for 20 years, destroyed the Philippine economy. And every single Filipino will understand this, because they're taught Ferdinand Marcos, his 20-year dictatorial rule, military rule, destroyed the entire Philippine economy. And Filipinos would probably cry an immense amount of sorrowness if they realized that their country could have had power of the U.S. dollar, the power of the U.S. economy, the power of the U.S. laws to protect them. And they would have rose like all ships rise with the U.S. economy. But left on their own, the Philippine government fell into 20 years of brutal military dictatorship due to Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Destroyed their entire economy. And they had to have a revolution in 1986 to form a free Philippines. So I'll get to that in a second. Spanish Empire occupied the Philippines for 333 years, spanning from 1565 to 1898. Spanish-American War. After its defeat, the Spanish-American War of 1898, Spain ceded its long-standing colony of the Philippines to the United States in the Treaty of Paris. The Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902 raged on. It was a battle for 3 years. Filipino President Emilio Aguinaldo was captured on March 23, 1901, and the war was officially declared over by the U.S. on July 4, 1902. Then, in 1902, the United States Congress passed the Philippines Organic Act, which created the Philippine Assembly, kickstarting kind of the beginning of, hey, there's 7,000 islands, this massive governance of the Filipino people, and let's start the process to where they can kind of just govern themselves. It's a 3-year war, right? And I'm going to tell you right now, you know, the sad part is that war never needed to happen. That 3-year battle, 1898 to 1902, right? The Spanish Empire was massive. And the ignorance was the Spanish Empire lost against the United States government and our powerful military and our powerful economy, right? We beat the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire was controlling the Philippines for 330 years. And then the naivete, you know, those Filipino soldiers didn't need to die in this massive 3-year battle. It wasn't necessary. Pride gets in the way sometimes. All right, U.S. military, we captured the former president, this Filipino revolutionary kind of government. But there's no need for them to fight for 3 years. I imagine they just kind of saw that Filipino revolutionary fighters, they just saw the Spanish Empire lose. They probably thought that was an opportunity. They probably had no inkling or understanding of across the waters how powerful the U.S. military actually was. So that 3-year battle was just their own naivete, leading young Filipino men to die for no reason. They had no idea, right? They were under Spanish imperial rule. They probably didn't have the proper education to understand how big or how powerful other nations were. This act was superseded in 1916, 14 years later, by the Jones Act, the Philippine Autonomy Act. This kickstarted the first official declaration of the United States government commitment to grant full independence to the Philippines. So you'll continually see this brainwashed, false information of history that the U.S. government controlled the Philippines for 50 years. That never existed. You know, that Philippine War, the Philippine-American War, should never happen. It was the pride and egotism of some revolutionary fighters not understanding how powerful the United States government was. All right. Even at the end of that war, the U.S. government was like, here's the Organic Act. We're going to create the Philippine Assembly. It's like the first steps of hey, governing yourselves. And then 14 years later, you had the Jones Act, Philippine Autonomy Act, kickstarted the first declaration of the United States government to commitment to gain full independence of the Philippines. It was just basically, even 14 years later, was like, hey, we want the Philippines to govern themselves. Those govern, the U.S. government in that time. And then in 1934, this is huge. There's the Tidings-McDuffie Act, created the Commonwealth of the Philippines. It increased self-governance, established a process towards full independence of the Filipino people. Even in 1934, the 1934 Tidings Act, the Philippines Independence Act, was a U.S. federal law signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, aka FDR, on March 24, 1934. So there was never a 50-year imperial rule of the United States. There was a horrific 3-year battle that should never happen. And even then, 14 years later, the U.S. government was saying, hey, we want the Philippines to govern themselves. And the FDR was like, hey, what's going on in the Philippines? And he's like, he's probably thinking, hey, are they on the road to independence? And then he's like, all right, we need to stamp and create a federal law that just basically pushes this into a much more concrete point of view of like, it established a 10-year time frame for the, literally created 10-year timeline for the Philippines to transition from the United States territory. You're under our protectorate to independent nation. But this is when everything messed up, because we should have formed the Philippines into multiple new states with new senatorial positions, new congressional representatives. Imagine the economy, right, of the Philippines in 1934 if they were given access to the U.S. stock exchange with USD empowered economy. They would have flourished. Like, man. This is U.S. Imagine 1934 if the Philippines had a USD economy. Prior to World War II, those bonds and certificates would have created, right? Imagine the Filipino people in 1934 with USD empowered economy. They would have been better off now 80 plus years than on their own. And that's sad. Cuba would have been better off being the fifth third state of the United States with our USD empowered economy. They would have flourished, then left on their own to another dictatorship. That's statesmanship. That's craftsmanship. That's governance. So I really dislike how people somehow create this false 50-year fake imperial United States rule of the Philippines. FDR set the framework in 1934 for the Philippines to be free. 2 thumbs up. Sad news ensues in December of 1941. The Japanese Empire attacks the United States, Pearl Harbor, aka they attack Hawaii on the 7th of December 1941. The Japanese Empire then invades the Philippines. Subsequently, on the 8th of December 1941, at the same time, roughly give or take a few hours. The 4 years of brutal Japan Empire occupation. Some people define it as 3 years and like 11 months or something like that. It's 4 years. You know, it's 4 years of brutal. It's like 3 years. 3 years and like 11 months is basically 4 years of brutal Japanese Empire occupation, illegal occupation, and Japanese brutal rule. They committed crimes against humanity. You have in 1945, you have Army General Walter Kruger and approximately 175,000. Almost, some people have stated it's 176,000 American soldiers, a part of the 6th Army unit, landed in Lingayen Gulf in the Philippines for the Battle of Luzon. And the Japanese had captured Luzon Islands back in February 1942. But like I said, the war kickstarted around December of 1941, that fall or winter of December 1941. It was actually 6 months of battling to when the Philippines fell completely in May of 1942, technically. But the Luzon Island group is important. It is the biggest island group of the Philippines. Island of Luzon, the Luzon Island group is the biggest. And so the Japanese felt like, hey, they captured the pearl of the Pacific, which is Manila. There was a lot of French and American architecture in the Philippines, and it looked immaculate back then. And it was defined as the pearl of the Pacific. until the Japanese Empire invaded and in 6 months' time captured Luzon and subsequently destroyed French architecture and American architecture of Manila. And then you have 1945, you have Filipino resistance fighters alongside 176,000 American soldiers push to liberate the Luzon Island chain. Battles raged on until August 15th of that same year, 1945, when the Japanese surrendered. And it was the key battle to liberate Manila and capture the capital of the Philippines. The mission was complete when General Douglas MacArthur in World War II Philippines campaign had fulfilled his pledge to return to the Philippines following his failures, his retreat, his departure of the Philippines at the beginning of World War II, to retake back the Luzon Island chain and stop the Japanese Empire and liberate the Philippines. The United States officially recognized the independence of the Philippines on the 4th of July, 1946. President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, during that time, issued a proclamation, Executive Proclamation 2695, which formally withdrew the U.S. sovereignty and recognizing the archipelago as a separate self-governing nation, which I think, looking back to it now, we should have never left the Philippines to be on their own, because it turned into a 20-year dictatorship and I think multiple revolutions, as mandated by the 1934 Tidings-McDuffie Act, signed by FDR. Yeah, former president of the Philippines, President Macapagal. I do apologize. I don't know how to say their last name. Macapagal. Maybe it's President Macapagal. Moved the Philippines' independence date from July 4th to June 12, 1962. This is later officially solidified by Executive Public Act of the Philippine President, number 4166, signed on the 4th of August, 1964. Years later, after World War II. This is what is that? Do the math real quick. Oh my goodness. My apologies. Is that 29 years later? 29 years later after World War II, and in honors of the permanent observance of the original, it's very political. This is all facetious because they were honoring 1898 declaration by Emilio Aguinaldo, but I think that was just to give honor to the senseless killings and deaths of the conflict of the Philippine-American War. That should have never happened. And that was just their own naivete. They didn't understand. They didn't know how powerful the United States military was, how massive the United States military was, how powerful the United States governance was in 1898. When you had these revolutionary fighters doing this, there was no need for all that death, all that conflict. And technically, this is all political because I'll get to it later on, but after the 1934 Tidings Act, in 1935, the official Republic of the Philippines has their Declaration of Independence and is the creation of the Philippine Constitution in 1935. And the Philippine Constitution in 1935 is so important because it's a protected document, even today in the Philippine Historical Archives, and of the Corazon Museum where it's housed. So you have the Philippines and the United States have been allies since July of 1946, exactly 79 years and 11 months. To update this month, because this is May, June, so May of last month was 10 months. It's 79 years and 11 months to June today as I'm recording this video. And it is a continued forward defense in the defense of the Filipino people and the Pacific. So even after 330 years of brutal Spanish imperial occupation of the Philippines are free now. And so too will Palestine be free from the British Empire crown colony named Israel, aka the Ideal Colony, aka the Fascist Zionist Empire. Godspeed. Battle of Manila in 1945. There's a 25-minute World War II documentary that is brutal. It shows Philippine resistance fighters and the video recordings of Philippine resistance fighters and of U.S. soldiers 176,000 of them battling to fight and liberate Manila from the Japanese Imperial Empire. Battle of Manila in 1945 was the only urban battle in the American Pacific War, comparable to Stalingrad, Berlin, or other European major battles. In the grueling weeks of fighting, the U.S. 6th Army fought house to house, building to building, clearing entrenched Japanese soldiers, quote unquote, from real time history. The Liberation of Manila in World War II in the Philippines is a YouTube link. It's a 1 hour and 10-minute documentary on the liberation of the Philippines from the fascist empire of Japan. This video was created in July 2nd of 2021. A very important video. Warning, it's a video for only people that are 18 and up because of how brutal this documentary is. It's a 1 hour and 10-minute documentary. You're going to see a lot of soldiers dying, a lot of civilians dying in this documentary. So it's only for those that are 18 plus. On the 9th of January, 1945, the U.S. Army returned the island of Luzon to the Philippines. Landings on the beaches alongside to the end, between the 3rd of February and 3rd of March, elements of the 6th United States Army participated in a month-long block-to-block battle. I thought I already talked about this. My apologies. Liberation of Manila recounts the U.S. Army's most difficult experience of urban warfare during the Second World War and only in the Pacific Theater. This is from the Army University Press on YouTube. Yeah, they just kind of confirm. Oh, this is a synopsis of that battling documentary. The 1935 Constitution was pivotal. It's foundational. Right? This is the declaration of, technically speaking, this is the declaration of the independence of the Philippines. The 1935 Constitution that was formed by the National Assembly of the Philippines and signed into law by the U.S. government. So this is the 1935 Constitution. This is the 1935 Philippines Constitution was the foundational legal document for the Commonwealth of the Philippines. It was drafted in 1934 at the Constitutional Convention, approved by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, brilliant president, and all that, good guy, FDR. In March 1935, it was then ratified by the Filipino people of their National Assembly on May 14th, 1935. And to confirm the actual Philippine history, since the creation of the 1935 Philippine Constitution, the Philippines Republic was then under a 10-year supervision kind of period, as then the United States government under FDR transitioned the Philippine Republic to become independent, and only to be interrupted by the invasion and occupation of, my apologies, 3 years and 11 months or 4-year Japanese imperial illegal occupation. Japanese Empire attacked the Philippines on the 8th of December 1941. At the same time, they attacked Hawaii or Pearl Harbor in 7th of December 1941. So this was Japan launched the invasion of the Philippines on December 8th, but at the same time, a few hours apart, the 7th of December 1941, they attacked Hawaii, the United States. It was attack of Pearl Harbor, which gets, this is kind of, their hours apart. Initial assault began with the devastating aerial bombardment of U.S. soldiers and Filipino soldiers, but Filipino military bases and U.S. bases were then bombed by Japan in December 1941. It followed then a major ground invasion by the Japanese Empire. The surprise attack on key locations like Clark Field, Cavite Navy Yard wiped out large portions of the American air and naval forces on the regions. It was a surprise attack. So it just it took the Philippine Army bases and the U.S. Army bases by surprise. But remember, during this time, this is now 6 years later. So the formation of the, did it pass it? Oh my God. The formation of the Republic of the Philippines and declaration of their independence and the creation of the Philippine Constitution was in 1935. So for 6 years, right, the Philippine government was already independent. They just had, the United States government just had like a supervisory role. They're operating on their own. Heck, even since 1914, 1916, with the Organic Act, like I was just telling you before, was trying to inform the Philippine government that to operate on their own. 6 years into the Philippines governance, 6 years, the 6th year, right, of the 1941. This is after 1935. The Republic of the Philippines was operating, and they were attacked. And the fall of Manila was in January 2nd, 1942, and then it wasn't until like May of 1942 that all the Philippines fall or succumb to Japanese fascist imperial control and illegal occupation of the Philippines. Yeah, even despite there was a prolonged defense, only about 6 months, General Douglas MacArthur, United States general, combined American and Filipino forces, eventually overwhelmed by the overwhelming number of Imperial Japanese army. And the Philippines, cannot say they were independent because of the Philippine Empire. They had invaded, they'd attacked over the course of 6 months. Then the Philippine government, or the Republic of the Philippines, and the armed forces of the United States fell. It led to 66,000 plus Filipino soldiers and 12,000 American soldiers captured. So I need to remind people that in 1935, right, you have the formation of the Philippine Constitution, a protected document that's historical. It formed the first republic, the Republic of the Philippines. The vast majority of their soldiers were Filipino soldiers. So there were 66,000 Filipino soldiers alive, and there were 12,000 American soldiers that were alive. And they were fighting as hard as they can for 6 months, and they became overwhelmed. Filipino bases fell, U.S. bases fell by Japanese imperial rule, Japanese fascist imperial rule. This led to 66,000 Filipino soldiers captured and 12,000 U.S. soldiers captured. And the 9th of April, 1942, in the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire offensive and almost completely captured and occupied the Philippines, but not quite. I do understand that there's the historical context that even though all of the Philippines was captured in 1942, it actually isn't accurate. There were still islands that were never fully captured, but they were in the Visayas region, in the central region of the Philippines. There's the northern Luzon island chain, there's the central Visayas chain, and there's the larger Mindanao chain of islands in the south. And essentially all of Mindanao was captured, all of the Luzon island chains were captured, and partially the Visayas island chains were captured, but not all of the island chains were captured. But in terms of occupation, you could say the Philippine government had fallen. U.S. soldiers had been captured, but the vast majority of the soldiers captured returned to PALs with 60,000 Filipino soldiers and 12,000 American soldiers. And in that time frame, like I said, 9th of April 1942, the spring of 1942, and the Japanese offensive led to the capture and occupation of the Philippines. Majority of the Philippines, not all the Philippines, was captured. It led to this horrific, brutal, and sadistic act of the Japanese Empire called, they had captured 78,000 American Filipino soldiers. Only 12,000 were American soldiers, which means 66,000 were Filipino soldiers. And they had surrendered in the Bataan Peninsula on April 9th, 1942. The staggering number marks the single largest surrender of United States military in history, where the U.S. government lost 12,000 soldiers to become PALs. Probably still is the largest defeat of the. So in terms of U.S. warfare, archaeology or hapology, hippology. There's a whole Greek term when it comes to defining the Latin term of warfare. I think it's hapology, which is defined as warrior culture, warfare, whatever. But in terms of the United States historical prevalence of warfare, defined of warfare, the biggest defeat was the U.S. losing 12,000 soldiers. Well, losing thousands of soldiers to the Japanese, and losing 12,000 soldiers to be captured by the Japanese Empire. Following the surrender, the prisoners of war were subjected to unspeakable atrocities. The key details of this is defined as the Bataan Death March in the Bataan Peninsula of the Philippines. The Japanese imperial forces that captured Filipino soldiers and American soldiers, they endured a brutal 65-mile trek through tropical heat with no food and no water. It's extremely hard. The longest I've ever gone distance-wise, about 31 miles, I think 33 or 34 miles, I do apologize. was a long time ago when I was younger. The longest kind of distance I've gone, I think, was on foot. I think was 30 or 34 miles. I forget. I do apologize. It was a long time ago. How old was I? Was I 20 years old? I think I was 20 years old. I was up in Oregon, and I just wanted to test myself. And so I walked on foot from my then private art university campus in downtown Portland, and I walked all the way to Gresham, Oregon, where my family was living at, staying at. My mom's house, mother's house, the family house, mom's house. And I think it's I could double check right now. Yeah, what am I talking? Oh my. No, it's not that distance. It's without putting into. I think it was 16 miles. What was the? Oh, it was 28 miles. 28.4 miles. Yeah, I think it was to Sandy, Oregon. I think. I forget. It's a long time ago. But so the most I've gone is like I think it was like 28 miles or something like that. But yeah, I couldn't imagine 65. I couldn't imagine 65 miles with nothing. That's crazy. At least there's a mom and pop, bodegas or grocery stores along the way. Something like that. But I digress. And the casualties were, probably upwards of 7,000, 10,000 Filipino American soldiers starved to death or died along the way, or were murdered by Japanese soldiers along the way. The hellish prison camps, the survivors of this 65-mile death march with no water or food. It was the dying of thousands of Filipino and American soldiers. Yeah, years later, in the late 1944, Japanese concentration camp guards feared the American rescue of 140 American PALs on Palawan Island. They herded them into shelters and set them on fire and threw grenades at them. But the Bataan Death March, as Japanese Empire forced Filipino PALs and U.S. soldiers to march 65 miles without food, in turn torturing 9,000 plus Filipino and American troops starved to death as they walked to their death under tropical heat with no stopping. This is to further explain the Philippine history of the 14th of May 1935 with the formation of the first Philippine Constitution and the formation of the Republican government of the Philippines. It formed the Republic of the Philippines. This can be seen and should be seen as the first official independence declaration of the Philippines. And why is this important? Because you continue to see political speak of people not understanding the 19th century of the Philippines, which is 333 years of brutal Spanish, from multiple centuries, the 16th, 17th, 18th to 19th century, 330 years of Spanish Empire, brutal imperialistic control, right? And then the 19th century, as we're talking into the 20th century, because the Philippines started the Philippine-American Revolutionary War in the 19th century, and it went into in 1898 into the 20th century. In 1902, when the U.S. government captured the then revolutionary leader, of this group. And that revolutionary leader called himself like the first Philippine president, but he can't technically be the first Philippine president because the Philippines was never free until now. So it's why is this important? Because there is a gold and black chess that's the repository of the 1935 Philippine Constitution that formed the Republic of the Philippines. It's displayed in the Quezon Museum and Quezon Memorial Circle in Quezon City in the Philippines. Gold lane chess, 1935 Philippine Constitution. You will also see is that the 1987 Philippine governance during the presidency of Corazon C Aquino, the National Assembly then amended the Philippine Constitution and changed the Republic of the Philippines by expanding the Articles of the Constitution of the Philippines, but it recognizes the 1935 Constitution of the Philippines as the first document as being amended. So, for example, in the United States, we look at it as 250 years of America. Goes back to the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, 1776. This document separates the United States from Great Britain. Well, the British Empire. Excuse my French. Forget Great Britain. Or fuck the British Empire, if y'all want to be more 21st century slang or whatever. So, can I show? Constitution of the Philippines, 1935. The Constitution currently in effect was enacted in 1987 during the administration of President Corazon C Aquino. She was the first female president of the United States. Properly known as the 1987 Constitution, Philippine constitutional laws recognized the three other previous constitutions having effectively been governed by the country. 1935 Commonwealth Constitution, but this is the Constitution of the Philippines, adopted by the Philippine Constitutional Convention in the city of Manila, 18th day of February, 1935. So think of it as like 1935 is like it's them. They're doing it. The peoples. And it was then approved by the President of the United States on the 23rd day of 1900, basically 1935. The Filipino people, imploring the aid of divine providence in order to establish a government that shall embody their ideals, conserve and develop the patrimony of the nation, promote the general welfare, and secure to themselves and their posterity the blessings of the independence and the regime of justice, liberty, democracy, ordained and promulgated by this Constitution. Created the national territory, created the Declaration of Principles, but this is their Declaration of Independence. How we celebrate 250 years of our 1776 Declaration of Independence. Bada boom, bada bang. So in all technicality, right? Technically, the 8th day of February of 1935 is the official independence of the Philippines. But you'll see whole bunch of political apparatus within the Philippine governance to change the state. Technically. So it's recognized in the 1935 Constitution of the Philippines as the first document as being the amended change by increasing the power of the legislative branch. Oh, my bad. So the 1987 Constitution by President Corazon Aquino, first female president of the Philippines, National Assembly that amends the Philippine Constitution, changed the Republic of the Philippines by expanding the articles of the Constitution of the Philippines, but it recognizes the 1935 Constitution of the Philippines as the first document as being amended, changed, or increased the power of the legislative branch of the Republic of the Philippines. If we look at it now, the first female president of the Philippines, Corazon Aquino, she saved the Philippines. Godspeed to Miss Aquino and her peoples. We see that the former president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., maintained a 20-year rule in the Philippines from 1965 to 1986 in a legal government, much like Venezuela, when you had the Nicolas Maduro Marcos. What is it again? I'm totally forgetting this dude's name. Yes, there you go. Nicolas Maduro Moros, the leader of the Sun Cartel and the former illegal president of Venezuela. Same kind of thing. Same thing. Yeah. We had a the defendant, Nicolas Maduro Moros, is the leader of the Sun Cartel, the illegitimate, illegal president of, dictator of Venezuela and all that. This was the United States versus Nicolas Maduro Moros, Diosdado Cabillo Rondon, Ramon Rodriguez Chacin, Celia de la Flores del Maduro, Nicolas Ernesto Maduro Guerrero, also known as Nicolasito, also known as the Prince, and Hector Rosenford Guerreros Flores, also known as Nino Guerrero. As a sealed indictment, grand jury, American civilian peers, right? Here's the checkmate, to put this, there's no qualms, there's no tears cried over the Sun Cartel leader that aided a whole bunch of terrorist organizations that were murdering Mexican government officials. Right? The Sun Cartel leader is Nicolas Maduro. He gave weapons and bombs to these terrorists in Mexico that then murdered Catholic leaders and Mexican government officials. For 25 years, the leaders of Venezuela have been abused their positions of public trust with a corrupt, illegitimate government of Venezuela because they kept importing, thousands of tons of cocaine into the United States. Nicolas Maduro Moro, right, the former cartel leader of the Suns and the former illegitimate president of Venezuela, right, is a defendant against the United States because he transported thousands of tons of cocaine into the United States. His cartels transported thousands of tons of cocaine from Venezuela into Mexico, into the United States. He fueled a ton of cocaine drug warfare across the Americas. And him and his regime and his family benefited massively. I can go over the 25-page grand jury charges, the unsealed indictment of the Sun Cartel leader Maduro another time. Because the blood of innocent Mexicans is on the hands of Maduro. much like an illegitimate president of Venezuela, was in the same vein as Ferdinand Marcos. 20-year rule. He violated the very Republic of the Philippines. He became a dictator, brutal military dictator, and violated their own constitution and decided to rule for 20 years, 1965 and 1986. This would have never happened, hindsight 50-50, if FDR had just formulated the Philippines into multiple new states, maybe 7 states, maybe 10 states of the United States. You know, they would have been like the 54th to like the 64th, you know, states added to the United States. It would have been, you know, because then the Philippines would have had separate governors and separate congressional leaders, right? And it would have never been a 20-year brutal rule. Hindsight 50-50 looking at it now. It was a dictatorship under former President Ferdinand Marcos, aka Marcos Sr. He violated the 1935 Republic of the Philippines Constitution through military rule when he declared martial law in 1972. Is after he served his legally obligated 8-year term, right? He created a fascist military dictatorial rule and then ruled like an iron fist. And because he didn't want to legally step down and lose power. And it wasn't until 1986, and in 1986, it was the People Power Revolution that Marcos Sr. officially lifted the martial law in 1981, and he retained his dictatorial powers during his 20-year rule, but ultimately fell apart in February 1986. You know, following the widespread economic collapse, because every time you have a fascist military dictator, there's always an economic collapse. Always. He had fraudulent elections under his 20-year rule for Marcos Sr. He had the People's Power Revolution, which forced Marcos Sr. into exile, leading to the brilliant first female president of the Republic of the Philippines, the president, Miss Corazon C Aquino. Amen. You know, she saved the Philippines, ended the Marcos Sr. dictatorship. Her husband, following the assassination of her husband, the opposition leader, Benigno Aquino Jr., the presidential candidate, then Miss Corazon C Aquino, became the face of the 1986 People-Powered Revolution. She saved the Philippines and the Republic. Yeah, there's a YouTube link. Philippine President Corazon C Aquino, her historic address to the United States Congress on the 18th of September of 1986 in Washington, D.C., her brilliant speech as the face of the free Philippines after 20 years of a brutal military dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. We'll play this in a second. And so this is the yes, you can stream or broadcast the Corazon Aquino historic 1986 speech to the U.S. Congress as an official U.S. government works or generally considered public domain. However, simply restreaming, copyright video, broadcast, or automatic contact log on it. So we're going to do all this by properly, paying recognition of the fact that it's in the public domain, restreaming risk. It's okay. So I'll give my copyright respects and all that to, well, there's other videos too. There's the 29-minute speech, the 24-minute speech, RTV Malacanang. You can watch it there. There's also some person named AmericanRhetoric.com, 32,000 subscribers, 844,000 views. He put this video up on August 16, 2018. The Philippine President Corazon C Aquino delivers the historic speech to the United States Congress, delivered on 18th of September, Washington, D.C. Enhanced the video and audio by AmericanRhetoric.com. So we're paying respects to their video. You can also click their link. This is Miss Corazon C Aquino. I'll watch the video now. Oh, wait. I need to double check that people can actually hear it.
Privilege, and I deem it a high honor and personal privilege to present to you Her Excellency Corazon C Aquino, President of the Republic of the Philippines.
Mr. Speaker, Senator Thurmond, distinguished members of Congress. 3 years ago, I left America in grief to bury my husband, Ninoy Aquino. I thought I had left it also to lay to rest his restless dream of Philippine freedom. Today, I have returned as the president of a free people. In burying Ninoy, a whole nation honored him by that brave and selfless act of giving honor. A nation in shame recovered its own. A country that had lost faith in its future found it in a faithless and brazen act of murder. So in giving we receive, in losing we find, and out of defeat we snatched our victory. For the nation, Ninoy became the pleasing sacrifice that answered their prayers for freedom. For myself and our children, Ninoy was a loving husband and father. His loss, 3 times in our lives, was always a deep and painful one. 14 years ago this month was the first time we lost him. A president turned dictator and traitor to his oath, suspended the Constitution and shut down the Congress that was much like this one, before which I am honored to speak. He detained my husband along with thousands of others, senators, publishers, and anyone who had spoken up for the democracy as its end drew near. But for Ninoy, a long and cruel ordeal was reserved. The dictator already knew that Ninoy was not a body merely to be imprisoned.
In reference to the former first female president of the Philippines, Ms. Corazon C Aquino, when she says the dictator, she's referencing Ferdinand Marcos Sr. and his brutal 20-year dictatorial rule.
But a spirit he must break. For even as the dictatorship demolished one by one the institutions of democracy, the press, the Congress, the independence of the judiciary, the protection of the Bill of Rights, Ninoy kept their spirit alive in himself. The government sought to break him by indignities and terror. They locked him up in a tiny, nearly airless cell in a military camp in the north. They stripped him naked and held the threat of a sudden midnight execution over his head. Ninoy held up manfully under all of it. I barely did as well. For 43 days, the authorities would not tell me what had happened to him. This was the first time my children and I felt we had lost him. When that didn't work, they put him on trial for subversion, murder, and a host of other crimes before a military commission. Ninoy challenged its authority and went on a fast. If he survived it, then he felt God intended him for another fate. We had lost him again, for nothing would hold him back from his determination to see his fast through to the end. He stopped only when it dawned on him that the government would keep his body alive after the fast had destroyed his brain. And so, with barely any life in his body, he called off the fast on the 40th day. God meant him for other things, he felt. He did not know that an early death would still be his fate, that only the timing was wrong. At any time during his long ordeal, Ninoy could have made a separate peace with the dictatorship, as so many of his countrymen had done. But the spirit of democracy that inheres in our race and animates this chamber could not be allowed to die. He held out in the loneliness of his cell and the frustration of exile, the democratic alternative to the insatiable greed and mindless cruelty of the right and the purging holocaust of the left. And then we lost him irrevocably and more painfully than in the past. The news came to us in Boston. It had to be after the 3 happiest years of our lives together. But his death was my country's resurrection in the courage and faith by which alone they could be free again. The dictator had called him a nobody, yet 2 million people threw aside their passivity and fear and escorted him to his grave. And so began the revolution that has brought me to democracy's most famous home, the Congress of the United States. The task had fallen on my shoulders to continue offering the democratic alternative to our people. Archibald MacLeish had said that democracy must be defended by arms when it is attacked by arms, and by truth when it is attacked by lies.
She's right. Former first female president of the Philippines. She is correct.
He failed to say how it shall be won. I held fast to Ninoy's conviction that it must be by the ways of democracy. I held out for participation in the 1984 election the dictatorship called, even if I knew it would be rigged. I was warned by the lawyers of the opposition that I ran the grave risk of legitimizing the foregone results of elections that were clearly going to be fraudulent. But I was not fighting for lawyers, but for the people, in whose intelligence I had implicit faith. By the exercise of democracy, even in a dictatorship, they would be prepared for democracy when it came. And then also, it was the only way I knew by which we could measure our power, even in the terms dictated by the dictatorship. The people vindicated me in an election shamefully marked by government thuggery and fraud. The opposition swept the elections, garnering a clear majority of the votes, even if they ended up, thanks to a corrupt Commission on Elections, with barely a third of the seats in Parliament. Now I knew our power. Last year, in an excess of arrogance, the dictatorship called for its doom in a snap election. The people obliged. With over 1 million signatures, they drafted me to challenge the dictatorship, and I obliged. The rest is the history that dramatically unfolded on your television screens and across the front pages of your newspapers. You saw a nation armed with courage and integrity stand fast by democracy against threats and corruption. You saw women poll watchers break out in tears as armed goons crashed the polling places to steal the ballots. But just the same, they tied themselves to the ballot boxes. You saw a people so committed to the ways of democracy that they were prepared to give their lives for its pale imitation. At the end of the day, before another wave of fraud could distort the results, I announce the people's victory. Many of you here today played a part in changing the policy of your country towards ours. We, the Filipinos, thank each of you for what you did, for balancing America's strategic interests against human concerns, illuminates the
Key point that the former president of the Philippines, the first female president, is saying is that the U.S. government should have and could have, hindsight 50-50, just created the Philippines into multiple states to be governed, but they didn't, at a behest to our own interests.
American vision of the world. The co-chairman of the United States Observer Team, in his report to the President, said, "I was witness to an extraordinary manifestation of democracy on the part of the Filipino people. The ultimate result was the election of Mrs. Corazon Aquino as President and Mr. Salvador Laurel as Vice President of the Philippines. When a subservient parliament announced my opponent's victory, the people then turned out in the streets and proclaimed me the President of all the people. And true to their word, when a handful of military leaders declared themselves against the dictatorship, the people rallied to their protection. Surely the people take care of their own. It is on that faith and the obligation it entails that I assumed the presidency. As I came to power peacefully, so shall I keep it. That is my contract with my people and my commitment to God." He had willed that the blood drawn with the lash shall not in my country be paid by blood drawn by the sword, but by the tearful joy of reconciliation. We have swept away absolute power by a limited revolution that respected the life and freedom of every Filipino. Now we are restoring full constitutional government. Again, as we restore democracy by the ways of democracy, so are we completing the constitutional structures of our new democracy under a constitution that already gives full respect to the Bill of Rights. A jealously independent constitutional commission is completing its draft, which will be submitted later this year to a popular referendum. When it is approved, there will be elections for both national and local positions. So within about a year from a peaceful but national upheaval that overturned a dictatorship, we shall have returned to full constitutional government. Given the polarization and breakdown we inherited, this is no small achievement. My predecessor set aside democracy to save it from a communist insurgency that numbered less than 500. Unhampered by respect for human rights, he went at it with hammer and tongs. By the time he fled, that insurgency had grown to more than 16,000. I think there is a lesson here to be learned about trying to stifle a thing with the means by which it grows. I don't think
is a reference to Ferdinand Marcos Sr. as being a fascist, military brutal dictator, much like Stalin.
I don't think anybody in or outside our country concerned for a democratic and open Philippines doubts what must be done. Through political initiatives and local reintegration programs, we must seek to bring the insurgents down from the hills, and by economic progress and justice, show them that which the best intentioned among them fight. As president of all my people, I will not betray the cause of peace by which I came to power. Yet equally and again, no friend of Filipino democracy will challenge this. I will not stand by and allow an insurgent leadership to spurn our offer of peace and kill our young soldiers and threaten our new freedom. Yet I must explore the path of peace to the utmost, for at its end, whatever disappointment I meet there is the moral basis for laying down the olive branch of peace and taking up the sword of war. Still, should it come to that, I will not waver from the course laid down by your great liberator. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and for his orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Like Abraham Lincoln, I understand that force may be necessary before mercy. Like Lincoln, I don't relish it. Yet I will do whatever it takes to defend the integrity and freedom of my country. Finally, may I turn to that other slavery, our $26 billion foreign debt. I have said that we shall honor it. Yet the means by which we shall be able to do so are kept from us. Many of the conditions imposed on the previous government that stole this debt continue to be imposed on us who never benefited from it. And no assistance or liberality commensurate with the calamity that was visited on us has been extended. Yet ours must have been the cheapest revolution ever.
In reference to the 20-year brutal Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Military dictatorship, and then the 1986-1987 kind of people-powered revolution within the Philippines and liberate themselves to restore their constitutional republic. This is her plea to the U.S. Congress, essentially, like, hey, can we have some regress to the fact that there was 20 years of a brutal dictatorship, of illegitimate government, right, of a dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., called the dictator, who had violated their own 1935 Constitution of the Philippines, and then just everything around it.
With little help from others, we Filipinos fulfilled the first and most difficult condition of the debt negotiation, the full restoration of democracy and responsible government. Elsewhere and in other times of more stringent world economic conditions, Marshall Plans and their like were felt to be necessary companions of returning democracy. When I met with President Reagan, we began an important dialogue about cooperation and the strengthening of friendship between our two countries. That meeting was both a confirmation and a new beginning. I am sure it will lead to positive results in all areas of common concern. Today, we face the aspiration of a people who had known so much poverty and massive unemployment for the past 14 years, and yet offer their lives for the abstraction of democracy. Wherever I went in the campaign, slum area or impoverished village, they came to me with one cry: democracy. Not food, although they clearly needed it, but democracy. Not work, although they surely wanted it, but democracy. Not money, for they gave what little they had to my campaign. They didn't expect me to work a miracle that would instantly put food into their mouths, clothes on their back, education in their children, and give them work that will put dignity in their lives. But I feel the pressing obligation to respond quickly as the leader of a people so deserving of all these things. We face a communist insurgency that feeds on economic deterioration, even as we carry a great share of the free world defenses in the Pacific. These are only two of the many burdens my people carry, even as they try to build a worthy and enduring house for their new democracy that may serve as well as a redoubt for freedom in Asia. Yet no sooner is one stone laid than two are taken away. Half our export earnings, $2 billion out of $4 billion, which is all we can earn in the restrictive markets of the world, must go to pay just the interest on a debt whose benefit the Filipino people never received. Still, we fought for honor, and if only for honor, we shall pay. And yet, should we have to wring the payments from the sweat of our men's faces and sink all the wealth piled up by the bondsmen's 250 years of unrequited toil? Yet, to all Americans, as the leader of a proud and free people, I address this question: has there been a greater test of national commitment to the ideals you hold dear than that my people have gone through? You have spent many lives and much treasure to bring freedom to many lands that were reluctant to receive it. And here you have a people who want it by themselves and need only the help to preserve it. Years ago, I said, "Thank you, America, for the haven from oppression and the home you gave Ninoy, myself, and our children, and for the 3 happiest years of our lives together." Today I say, join us, America, as we build a new home for democracy, another haven for the oppressed, so it may stand as a shining testament of our two nations' commitment to freedom.
I hope all Filipino people have seen this speech from President Corazon C Aquino, and all Americans of the United States have or should see the 24-minute video, this historic speech of the first female president of the Philippines and their free republic of the Philippines. It's about 1 hour and 31 minutes. Let me end the video now.